Hello, hello, writers. Welcome to the second day of our training on Get Your Acts Together. I hope everybody's doing well. I am just getting everything. I think looks like I'm live, but I'm just kind of checking to make sure that everything is working. And if you are on, definitely say hi and let me know. And I'm really excited. Day 2. We're going to be talking about Act 2. Logical, right? Okay. So if you are new to me, just a quick introduction. My name is Kate Johnston. I am a writing coach, a creativity mindset coach, and an editor. I work with developing writers, experienced writers, and small businesses to help them get the story that they want to tell out into the world. And I especially love working with writers who are willing to learn and grow and flourish and just figure out how to write the story to the best of their ability, which everyone can do. They just have to put a little heart and determination to it, and it'll happen for them. All right. The other thing to mention too, my areas of expertise include private coaching, group coaching. I also do online work as well as in-person work. And as far as editing, I focus mainly on developmental editing, but I also do copy editing and proofreading. I pretty much do it all because I think it's just that I love writing so much and I love all elements of story. So I find all of it to be really interesting and fun. And I'm really excited to put this training on for you about structure because I think it's probably one of the most complicated concepts for writers, especially when we're trying to put a story together. And we all understand, what beginning, middle, and end is, right? But when we start digging into it and we understand that there's actually plot points that have jobs, and that you could put an event as your inciting incident, and it might actually not even work as your inciting incident. So it's really important to understand that you understand the role of every plot point that you have, and then understand how you can use character development and theme to bring that plot to life so that it feels like a natural journey that your character is going through. Understanding structure and being able to put one together so that it works. That's something that I believe comes through the 3 elements of plot, character, and theme. And when we can weave them together over the course of your whole story, then you will absolutely have fewer plot holes. You'll avoid that sagging middle that we're going to be talking about today, and you'll have fewer loose threads. You'll also have a stronger handle on your character and his motivation, the story goal that he's trying to reach. So structure really does act as the foundation to your story. And even though, so much more goes into putting a story together, it's more than just plot, character, theme. If you can get the structure down, at least through the plot points, if you can just figure out your 3 acts, then it'll be a lot easier to figure out what goes in between all those plot points. Yesterday we talked about Act 1, and today we're going to be talking about Act 2, which is your middle. Now, 2 things to keep in mind about the middle so that you have a clear understanding of what you're dealing with. The middle is typically the longest act of the 3. And because it's the longest act, some writers find it's a lot easier to treat it as two smaller acts hinged together by the midpoint. The midpoint of your story is the middle, and it's usually at around the 50th percentile. And so if you're somebody who feels overwhelmed by the idea of a really super long act, then it might be easier for you to treat it like two smaller acts hinged by that midpoint. If you do it that way, then you're really dealing with four acts and instead of three acts. But don't worry, because the strategy doesn't change. The jobs of the plot points don't change. It's just you're just dealing with one extra act, and it doesn't change anything about how those plot points work or where they're placed. Um, Otherwise, you would have if you did worked with three acts, then your middle is going to be longer, and you still have that midpoint in the middle of your second act. The other thing to keep in mind is your act two is considered the reaction phase of the book. So in act one, yesterday we talked about how act one is considered introduction or setup, where we kind of get to know everything, we get grounded in the story, we connect emotionally with your character, we kind of get a sense of what they're up against. We also see them in their current world, and then we get to see them transitioning to their new world. Act two is known as the reaction act. Don't make the mistake of thinking that reaction means thinking, dreaming, wondering, planning, ruminating, daydreaming, because those are all passive ways for your character to just kind of not do anything. And that creates a really flat act. And you don't want that. You want act two to move, you want it to peak. You want your midpoint to be, really the summit of that mountain that they're climbing. And the only way you're going to be able to do that is to keep things happening. So reaction really means that your character is taking action based on action. So they're reacting with action. They're not reacting with thought. That's not to say that they don't spend time thinking, but you want to really be careful that you don't have large passages of narrative or exposition during your second act. You want to absolutely bring in smaller story events that can help break up this really long act. And yes, your character is learning a lot. Your character is uncovering information. Your character is discovering stuff, but he also needs to be acting and doing things while all of this information is coming to him instead of just thinking about it. Okay. So that will help you if you can keep that in mind, then, act two, as long as you keep in mind that act two needs to really still be small actions filled with actions, even though there's really only one major turning point, which is your midpoint throughout that act. I actually, there's three pieces that I refer to when I talk about act two in terms of structure. So we've got the midpoint. We've just talked about that. That's your middle, right? The 50th percentile. Yesterday, if you'll remember, when we talked about act one, the final major turning point of act one that kind of ends act one and kind of brings us into act two was the first major dilemma. Between the first major dilemma and your midpoint is a very long stretch of story, and I call that the story stretch one, actually. And story stretch one is where we get into trouble if we're only using narrative and exposition and not showing our character doing stuff. So what you want to be doing during story stretch one is your character is typically learning a new skill, or if they have a skill, they're sharpening that skill, they're honing it in some way. Okay. The other thing that also happens in story stretch one is the love story emerges. So that if you have a love story subplot, that's what you want to is also the time where your antagonistic forces are going to be ramping up. And keep in mind that Act Two is while your protagonist is learning new information and honing their skills and maybe falling in love, the antagonist has a job to do, right? They're not just going to let your protagonist do what he needs to do, because what is the role of your antagonist? The role of your antagonist is to stop your protagonist from getting what he wants. That's the role. So we make the mistake of thinking the antagonist is this evil character who is one-dimensional and um, doesn't have really his own personal agenda other than like sheer destruction. Obviously, it does depend on the story you're telling, and you could have an antagonist who is like strictly one-dimensional, evil, um, with no emotion whatsoever. You're better off to add another antagonist that we can kind of feel like it won't be so predictable. Because when you have that villain type, then it's very predictable about what could happen. When you have an antagonist or an antagonistic force, now I probably need to explain something. My term antagonistic force. Sometimes your antagonist is not a character necessarily. Sometimes it's an event. Right away, what comes to mind if you've seen the movie Twister? The antagonistic force was the twister. Okay, so like nature and events, things like that, situations can act as antagonistic forces. And absolutely, yes, you can have more than one in your story. I would say if you're better off having different antagonists and antagonistic forces throughout your story, because it just adds more layers to your story. But that antagonist is going to be also learning new information and honing their skills and, meeting new people, building up their team so that they can stop the protagonist. So you may not be in the point of view of your antagonist, and that's fine. You don't need to be, but your reader needs to be aware that your antagonist is absolutely stepping things up and creating more of a problem for your protagonist. So throughout story stretch one, it's very easy to get into, you can see how, because we're building these characters, you can see how easy it is to get into narrative and exposition and flashbacks and backstory. If you do that, fine, because obviously those elements, those storytelling elements are hugely important, but you don't want to have too much of it. You want to have that, be really careful about the balance. Bringing in more dialogue and more action scenes will help you keep that pace a lot faster. And at the midpoint, your antagonist will also have more information, okay? So it's not just your protagonist that has the run of the story at all. He is up against the antagonist. The antagonist is matching him beat for beat for beat. And I would even say surpassing your protagonist. Your antagonist still has to be ahead of the game throughout Act Two, because your protagonist has a lot to learn, has a lot of I would say that because of their limiting beliefs based on their ghost or their flaws, they're going to be in denial, and they're not going to be ready to make that ultimate change that they need to get to where they need to go. So the thing about your protagonist at this point is, even though they're getting more information, they're learning more about themselves. They may even be understanding a little bit about how they've contributed to their problem. They are still not ready to accept full responsibility. They're not ready to make the ultimate sacrifice. They still think that they can get what they want. They can solve the mystery. They can, find the treasure. They can get the girl, based on how on the self that they knew back in Act One. They may be willing to change one little thing about themselves, but that's an easy thing for them to deal with. They're not ready to accept that, oh wow, this is the lie that I've been telling myself this whole time. This is what yesterday we talked about the theme of love conquers all. And so possibly the lie that your character could believe is, I'm not lovable, so I'll never find the love of my life. And in Act Two, this character will be still dealing with that lie. And they may be able to sacrifice a little bit of that lie when they say, nobody loves me except, I have a really great relationship with my sister. She's the only one who truly understands me. She's the only one I can talk to. That would be a little bit of they're relinquishing a little smidge of that lie that they believe. And they can do that in Act Two. But the rest of it, they're still like, but everybody else never understands me, and I'll never find the love, anyone who will truly love me. That's just an example of how your character can get through Act Two. It's a lot of back and forth, a lot of taking a step forward and 2 steps back type of thing. You want to be careful that you're not repetitive, obviously. You don't want your character to be making the same mistake over and over, or saying the same thing over and over. Every little event that you bring in through Act Two needs to increase in momentum and stakes. They'll deal with one event, a small event, through story stretch 1, and then the next event needs to have a little bit more of a consequence to it, and then the event after that has to have more of a consequence. You need to build your momentum. If you're repetitive with the obstacles that your character comes into contact with, then it's just going to be flat. So you want to absolutely make sure that you're building momentum from one event to the next. All right. With the midpoint, that's the middle of your story. So this is where you're going to be absolutely raising the stakes. You're going to be bringing in more information that your character can use to fight back. So remember, we talked about Act Two is all about reaction, but eventually they're going to be fighting back, which is in Act Three. They're going to start fighting back towards the end of Act Two. They have information they need, enough information to get them going. They don't have everything they need. Maybe they found a new ally, because Act Two is a great time to be bringing in new characters. So it's possible that they have established a new friendship, a new ally, and that gives them some confidence to move forward and fight back. Something like that. And then story stretch 2, which is that stretch of story from midpoint into Act 3, again, is a very long stretch where there aren't major turning points during this stretch of time. So writers get themselves in a situation again where there's a lot of ruminating and thinking and dreaming and wondering and sipping their coffee, when what you need to be doing is bringing in more little events. Smaller story beats is what a lot of writers call them, little story beats. They're really incidents. They're situations that your character gets involved in and can't avoid getting involved in. That gets worse and worse and worse. He's getting deeper and deeper and deeper into the situation. While that's happening, he's learning more and more and more about himself, and he's he's getting closer to that lie that he's been telling himself all along, and it's becoming unavoidable. He's remember yesterday we talked about how your character needs to be dealing with two choices, a bad choice or a worse choice. If a choice is easy for your character to make, then it's not interesting to read about. Think about how your character can be in a situation where he is forced to deal with a bad choice or a worse choice. So it's all about consequence. What is at stake? If you don't know what is at stake for your character, what could he possibly lose? Or what is the worst thing that could happen if he doesn't get what he wants? And not even just for your story goal, through every single step that he takes, when he is fighting back and reacting throughout your whole story, if there isn't anything at stake for what he's doing, then there's no consequence, and so there's no meaning, there's no reason for it to be. There's no reason that you should even be putting it in your story. Ask yourself, with every event, every incident that your character is involved in, what is at stake? Because if there's nothing at stake, then it's not strong enough and it shouldn't be in your story. That's not to say, of course, that there shouldn't be any downtime. But even with the downtime, there's got to be a little bit of a consequence to it, okay? Like with your downtime, maybe they're getting, the team is getting to know each other. And the consequence to that, it is what? It totally depends on the story that you're telling, but there has to be tension throughout. And you want to use tension in different levels. So personal, inner tension, like that conflict with your own self, is always good, that battle, and that goes back to the lie that they've been telling themselves, the flaw, the limiting beliefs that have kept them from being able to get what they want. And then you've got the idea that if you have tension among your teammates, if you've got a team or community and there's tension between members, build on that. And then just, look at the different levels of tension, because when you can do that, then you are able to keep that middle from sagging. Always ask yourself, what is of consequence when my character, my protagonist, or any point of view character that you're dealing with, when you get them to make a choice, make sure that there's something of consequence to that choice. If it's an easy choice, it's not enough to move the story forward unless it does get them into unless it does get them into deeper, hotter water down the road. And so it may not be evident right away. The consequence may not be evident right away, but it could play out in the next chapter, or 40 pages later. And this is why plotting ahead of time is helpful. And I know we could go into a huge conversation about pantsing versus plotting, but that's like an entire video on its own. There's definitely something to be said in favor of both pantsing and plotting. In it, but I certainly don't want to get into the conversation now, because then I'll never finish the whole purpose of this video. Suffice to say that knowing what your story is, how it's going to play out, certainly through major events, will make it so much easier to figure out the story that you want to tell. And when you know the story that you want to tell, will help you figure out what story events need to be in your story. So it works both, they play off of each other. So it really is helpful to know both. Know the story that you want to tell before you start writing it, and know what kinds of story events will fit the story that you want to tell. And that if you can figure that stuff out before you actually begin writing scenes, the scenes will come easier for you. When we talk about character development throughout Act Two, you want to be remembering that the protagonist will be learning new skills, will be putting those skills to use, but will also be fighting his limiting beliefs. He will be up against that lie that he's told himself in Act One or prior to Act One. And this is the lie that he's not willing to relinquish yet. He may be willing to relinquish a little bit just to get out of a certain situation, but he's not quite ready. He's still in denial. All right. And while he's growing, he's like kind of growing, not growing, growing, not growing. He's definitely going through some conflict. The antagonist is also amping things up. It's really important that we get that antagonist to grow and continue to get in your protagonist's way. That's the job of the antagonist. If he's not getting in your protagonist's way, then your protagonist has free reign and he'll be able to do whatever he wants. So think about your antagonist in the sense of how can I develop the antagonist throughout Act Two so that I'm impeding my protagonist even more. All right, because they're going to amp things up just like your protagonist is. Your protagonist is modeled throughout Act Two. He's, the thing about midpoint, I wanted to mention this. I didn't mention it and I should have earlier. The midpoint can be either a false victory or a false defeat. So this totally depends on the kind of story that you want to tell. And you really should know this before you start writing. It'll save you a lot of time. If your character, going back to yesterday, we talked about how your character is in a current world and he transitions into a new world. The world not being necessarily location, but a state of being, whatever that might be for your character. Your character may be really excited to be in this new world. It may be something that he really has wanted all his life, and finally he gets it. And so Act Two, he's in this new world. He's like, oh, man, this is great. This is so much better than what I was dealing with, in Act One. And I am so excited to be here. That is very possible. So what that means, if that's your character, what that means is when you're writing your midpoint, the middle of your story, big story event, it's a turning point. You need to create an event that is a false victory, meaning that something happens where he thinks he's hit the jackpot, but it's not what he thought it was. And then he's in for a rude awakening after that. Okay, that's a false victory. And that's possible with a character who thinks he's making it in the new world, where he thinks that everything is great. He's, the star of the show, whatever it might be. And then he's in for a rude awakening at the midpoint. Versus a character who is miserable in their new world, a character who has gone kicking and screaming into the new world, or who has entered the new world knowing that they're unprepared, something like that, then that midpoint is going to be a false defeat, meaning that you're going to create an event at the midpoint where the character thinks all is lost, like the worst possible thing that could happen has just happened, and I have never had a worse experience than what I'm experiencing right now. That's a false defeat, because it's not, your protagonist isn't truly defeated at this point, but because he's so miserable and he couldn't possibly begin to think that things are ever going to get better, he's going to look at this event as the worst thing ever. So an example of that could be maybe a friend of his that he thought was an ally turns out to be his enemy. Um, or maybe he's uncovered a deep, dark secret about his past that has completely shattered him. Those kinds of events can absolutely serve as a false defeat. Obviously, again, it depends on the story you're telling. It depends on who your character is. It depends on the new world that they're in. So many things you have to modify for your own story. But what's important is that you understand the job of the midpoint, and that midpoint is the job is either, it's got to be an event. It has to be an event. It can't be, it's got to be an external event. Okay. Those are what are all turning points are: external events that we see in action. And the job of the midpoint is either it serves as false defeat or false victory. And that's where your character gains new awareness. So your character learns something new, or uncovers some new knowledge, or makes friends with somebody new, whatever it might be. And it's at that point that they have a reaction to whatever it is, right? Because your character has to respond. But from there, they take action in the sense of, okay, now what? Okay, because we're only midway through your story. So they can't give up. Otherwise, because you have another 150 pages to go, maybe. They can't give up. There's got to be something there in that false defeat or false victory that tells your character, well, what more do I have to lose, type of thing. Or I'll show them whatever your character's attitude might be. When you figure that out, it's easier to understand, okay, well, my story stretch 1 and my story stretch 2, now I kind of know how those are going to play out because I know what that big event is in the middle of my story. When you know what that big event is, it's a lot easier to figure out, okay, well, these are the little events that have to lead up to that midpoint, and these are the little events that have to lead from the midpoint into my third act. If you don't know your midpoint, if you don't know what that big event is, it's going to be a lot harder to figure out what those little events are. You might have visions of them in your mind. We all do. But it's a lot different up here because it's not organized in a structural way. A lot of it's just kind of images that we have about our story. Once we start putting it into story form, it doesn't come out quite the way that it was up here. But that's because we didn't have structure when we're just imagining our story. So trying to get it into structure while you get things going is really helpful. So starting big with your big story events and then working your way down is a really helpful process. With your theme, I'll just say again that we're talking about a message that you as the author are relaying to your audience, and whether you're doing it to entertain, inform, or educate, or maybe a combination of 2 or 3. Okay, we're avoiding preaching. We're avoiding hitting people over the head with our message. So throughout Act 2, how does your theme make a difference if we're being really careful about how we're relaying that information? Well, remember that theme is also very closely related to our character's belief system. If your character has limiting beliefs about love, trust, loyalty, something like that, then his belief system is kind of opposite to the theme that the message that you want to relay. So for example, love conquers all. I used that earlier in the video. I'll keep going with it. Love conquers all is your theme. So your protagonist's belief system has to be challenged by that. That's the lie that they believe. That's they have a ghost or a wound that tells that they've told themselves a story, which isn't true. It's their lie. They've told themselves a lie based on a traumatic event that happened to them, and suddenly they're not able to believe anything um, that is happening, even though there's evidence, right? Even though they may have found, we talked about how the love story emerges in story stretch 1. They may be, if love conquers all, but their belief system is I'm unlovable, and then we've got this love story that emerges, they're going to be resisting that. So this is all showing up through subtext, through interactions with other characters, dialogue, tone. It's going to be not stated outright. You really want to do your best to avoid that and instead just show it through symbolism or other literary devices. So Act 2 is going to be that belief system. We're finally at the point where your protagonist, his belief system is being challenged because of that new awareness that he's getting at the midpoint. He maybe has, uncovered that long lost secret about his past. And that information could shed some light onto that ghost that has been haunting him this whole time, that he created that lie, that he's unlovable, nobody loves me. And maybe that secret that he uncovered at the midpoint serves as evidence. Oh, that would explain some things, wouldn't it? But he's not quite there yet. He's not quite ready to accept the truth, because the truth is still is scarier than the lie. He's lived with the lie for so long. It's his comfort zone, right? It's that box that he's living in. If he was to accept the truth, that means he can't be embracing the lie anymore. That's giving up an old way of life. And that old way of life is what's bringing him comfort, even through Act 2. So but it's going to be challenged. So you want to be showing some challenges, some where he's being tested, where he's being given some clues or other ways of thinking and being that will help him move forward and fight back, which is really what Act 3 is about, is fighting back. And so that's where story stretch 2 is going to lead you into for Act 3, which is all about fighting back. So the last half of Act 2, even though I said that Act 2 is all about reaction, the last part of Act 2, though, has to show your characters starting to fight back. And Act 3 is all about fighting back. So there's a little bit of overlap. There's a little bit of overlap between all of the acts. With Act 1, we had the introduction and setup, and Act 2 is reaction. Act 3 is fighting back. So between Act 1 and Act 2, you're going to have a little bit of overlap between setting things up and having your character reacting to the new information, or resisting in some way, right? And then between Act 2 and Act 3, there's going to be that overlap of reaction, fighting back. Once we're solidly in Act 3, it's all about fighting back. That's why these story stretches on either side of your midpoint are really, really important, because they naturally build towards these acts and also create a natural progression for your character, so that he's not just suddenly finding himself in these moments where he's like, oh, okay, I'm all better now, right? He's got to build up to that, and we need to be able to see it through action, reaction, action, reaction. So that's Act 2. That is what your Act 2 is about. This is, I gave you some tips on how to avoid a sagging middle, and how, the importance of your antagonist forces, so that we're showing their progression in order to stop your protagonist from making any forward movement. Let me just check comments, see if there's any comments, if you have comments here. Okay. If you're watching the replay and you've got a question or a comment, definitely leave it. I will circle back and make sure that I get your questions answered. If you aren't in my Facebook group, come on by and ask questions there as well. I'm happy to answer anything to do with structure, and we can even talk specifically about the story that you're working on, because as I said at the beginning of this video, and I may have even said it yesterday, is, this is all blanket information, but you have to modify it according to the story that you're telling. So it's all well and good to know that your midpoint is, the peak of your story, and that things have to get worse for your character. But if you don't know enough about your particular story, maybe you won't know how to make things worse. So if that's you, if that's where you're struggling, definitely come on by the group, and I'm happy to talk you through it. So tomorrow we'll talk about Act 3, and which is considered the ending of your book. And I'll be back here, same place, same time, and definitely I hope to see you there. So I hope you guys are doing well, and take really good care. All right, see ya.